So let me begin tonight with a question, or maybe I would call it a challenge. And the question is, what if I told you there was one thing that you could do daily that would make you happy? One thing. Would you believe it? Would you do it? Well, in fact, there's strong evidence, both in terms of formal research and anecdotal evidence, that if we commit one act of generosity daily, that we will experience greater happiness. There's a direct correlation between doing that act, however big or small, and increased sense of experience of happiness. And by generosity, what we're talking about is giving freely of oneself, one's possessions, one's time. No strings attached, no expectation for a payback or a return. Could be money, time, possessions, and it must be real. We can't just be phoning it in. We can't be faking it. We have to actually have it come from the heart. As you probably know, generosity is part of every major faith tradition going back thousands of years. In Christianity, it is written, "It is better to give than to receive." In Judaism, it is written, there are three main categories of generosity which should be practiced: giving of one's wealth, giving of oneself physically, and giving of one's wisdom. In Hinduism, they say, selfless service to mankind makes you free in the world of mortals. And in Buddhism, the Buddha, quote is attributed to the Buddha from the Pali Canon. He says, bhikkhus is the Pali word for monks. He's talking to his community of monks. Bhikkhus, if beings knew, as I know, the result of giving and sharing, they would not eat without having given, nor would they allow the stain of meanness to obsess them and take root in their minds. Even if it were their last morsel, their last mouthful, they would not eat without having shared it, if there were someone to share it with. But bhikkhus, as beings do not know, as I know, the result of giving and sharing, they eat without having given, and the stain of meanness obsesses them and takes root in their minds. So generosity, or the Pali word is dana, I used that term earlier, referring to the dana basket on the table, is deemed in Buddhism and in other traditions as the ideal foundation for spiritual growth. It is considered the fundamental base, the foundation upon which we build the rest of our spiritual practice. And it can be everything from a large gift of money or goods. It can be a small thing like a gentle word, a smile, an open mind, a gift of food or money. But it flowers when we allow our heart to open and express it and acknowledge that whatever we're giving or doing is coming from the heart. Some of you may remember a few years ago we offered a course on the 10 paramis. That's, again, a Pali word, which really is loosely translated as the 10 perfections. And these 10 perfections that the Buddha taught were considered as essential or necessary to obtain enlightenment. And the first one, and he does this intentionally, the first one is generosity, dana, the first of the 10. I won't go through the other 9, but I want to emphasize that he thought this was so foundational that he put it as the very first of the perfections or paramis. So we know that generosity has a preeminent place in the teachings of the Buddha. He talked about the path to awakening beginning with generosity, and that there is no freedom without cultivating generosity. Dana in the teachings refers both to the act of giving and the donation itself. Excuse me. So it's not just the act of giving, it's the thing that we give. He talked about it as being both. Excuse me. He also used the word kaja, I believe it's pronounced C-A-G-A, which is translated as the inner virtue of generosity and generally means renunciation. So there he's really getting at the idea that we have to feel the gift. It's something that we're giving of ourselves we're in terms of renunciation. And what he's really talking there about, I think, is the requirement that we give more than is required, more than is customary or expected relative to our own resources and abilities. The act of dana is first and foremost a practice of letting go, of ceasing to cling. And we know, again, from the Four Noble Truths, that clinging, grasping, is the source of so much of our suffering. So he brings the act of generosity, that foundational practice, right back to the cessation of suffering. That's how important it is in the teachings. So we are called upon to let go of our greediness, our clinging, our stinginess, our greed, our wanting to grasp, despite what our culture promotes. And we certainly know that that's what's promoted. You need more of this, more of that. You need a shiny this, a shiny that. But it's not just material things, because dana also requires that we give up some of our self-interest. We give some part of ourselves. Are we generous in attitude toward others? Do we treat everyone with dignity and respect as an act of generosity? Is our behavior generous in its nature? Are our actions generous in terms of the spirit with which we engage in our actions? This is a folk parable of unknown authorship. I wasn't able to find the source of it, although it shows up often when you do a Google search for generosity. A wise woman who was traveling in the mountains found a precious stone in a stream. The next day she met another traveler who was hungry, and the wise woman opened her bag to share her food. The hungry traveler saw the precious stone and asked the woman to give it to him. She did so without hesitation. The traveler left rejoicing in his good fortune. He knew that the stone was worth enough to give him financial security for the rest of his life. But a few days later, he came back to the woman and returned the stone to her. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know how valuable this stone is, but I give it back to you in the hope that you can give me something even more precious. Give me what you have within you that enabled you to give me that stone." So the Buddha stressed that spiritual efficacy or spiritual growth, is dependent on the attitude with which we give. And that comes up repeatedly in his teachings on generosity. So, for example, a small donation that really stretches someone who is of lesser means is considered of greater spiritual consequence than a personally insignificant donation from a wealthy person. You've probably seen those studies where they look at the percentage of income that those of lesser means give as opposed to the percentage of the income that those of greater means. And this is just from a magazine, it's called The Week, from last week. And it says Americans give about 3% of their income to charity each year. But in the years since the recession lifted, poor and middle class earners have dug deeper. Poor and middle income Americans increased their donations 5% from 2006 to 2012. While those earning more than $200,000 a year decreased their giving roughly by the same percentage. So how exactly does generosity make us happier? What is the relationship? What is the causality there? Well, I think there are several paths by which this happens. One is that it takes us out of ourselves, allows us to focus on others, perhaps focus on alleviating the suffering of others, but it takes us out of our own ego, out of ourselves. It helps us feel connected to the person to whom we're being generous. You remember those ads some years ago on TV about one of the charities for children. And if you donated, you would actually adopt the child in a third world country. They would send you a picture and a biography, and the child would write you. I think it was a brilliant strategy for making us feel connected to that child. And when they implemented that marketing plan, their donations just skyrocketed because they established a personal connection between the act of giving and the individual whom you were supposedly helping and being generous toward. And then thirdly, I think by activating or reinforcing our empathy and compassion. I mean, generosity really does come from that place of empathy and compassion. It comes from that open heart. And so by practicing it, we open the heart, we reinforce our capacity for empathy, our capacity for compassion. Now, again, generosity need not be dramatic, it need not be grand. Small acts of kindness done on a daily basis increase our happiness. Something like holding the door for someone, letting someone go in front of you in line, smiling at someone, and so forth. This is a quote from Sean Hick, and he says, "It's sad that in a world of billions, people can still feel isolated and alone. Sometimes all it takes to brighten up someone's day is a smile or a kind word, or the generous actions of a complete stranger. Small things, the tiny details, these are the things that matter in life. Such minuscule activities have huge ripple effects." You've all seen that bumper sticker about random acts of kindness. I think that addresses also this idea of generosity. Very often, small acts of generosity can have a huge ripple effect. It can have a profound effect on someone's life. I'll share a story with you. My youngest brother he's the fourth of the children in my family, is 10 years younger than me. So he was 8 when I left home. I never really knew him well until he was an adult. But we grew up in a small town in the Shenandoah Valley, and this would be the mid-'60s when he was maybe 7 or 8 years old. And in those days, certainly a small town in Virginia, the real way that a boy belonged was to be involved in athletics. You know, you would play on the team. That's what we did. Basketball, baseball, football, whatever. That was really the priority for a kid in the mid-'60s in a small town in Virginia. And my brother Drew he was what we would now call a geek. I mean, he had bad eyesight, big thick glasses. He had problems with his feet. He was very slightly built and uncoordinated. But it came time for Little League tryouts in our town, and all of his friends, his peer group, 6 or 8 guys he hung around with, played with, were going out for baseball. This was a huge deal. And in those days, unlike now, everyone didn't make the team. I mean, it was competitive. You had to be good enough to make the cut, and a lot of kids didn't make the team. So you'd go to a tryout, all the coaches would be there, they'd scout the kids, and then they would pick the roster and bargain and do a draft kind of thing. So Drew and his buddies all went to the tryouts, and of the 6 or 7 kids that he was friends with, he was the only one that didn't make a team. No big surprise to those of us in our family, but he was devastated because he felt now that he was no longer part of the tribe. He'd been cast out by his inability to perform athletically. He was really, really dejected, upset, felt terrible, thought his life was over, moped around the house. His best friend, Mike's dad was a coach of one of the teams, and Mike's dad was a tough guy. He'd been a Marine in World War II. He was a blue-collar guy that worked at the DuPont plant there, sort of a take-no-prisoners kind of guy. And he was Mike's coach, and some of the other kids got drafted onto his team. So about 3 days after the tryouts, after the rosters were posted, there's a knock on our door, and there's Mike's dad. And he says, "Is Drew here?" So we go get him. Drew comes to the door, and Mike's dad hands him a paper bag. And Drew looks at it, and there's a Little League uniform, and he says, "Tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Well, if one act could change a life, that was certainly it. I mean, this kid went from being, lower than low to sort of walking on air. I mean, he will tell you to this day, as he's approaching 60 years old, that that was a pivotal moment in his life. He was on the team for 3 years. I think he actually got in the game twice in 3 years for maybe one play when the score was really way out of whack, and struck out both times, but that didn't matter because to him he was back in the tribe, back in the club. But he did come away from that. So Mike's dad's generosity, the point of that story obviously, had such a huge impact on him and to this day. And he will tell you that he realized at the end of the Little League experience that he was not going to be a world-class athlete. But because his confidence had been restored, he will tell you by this act, he found his way to the drama department at the high school, went on to get a BFA and then an MFA in acting and directing. He's a stage fight choreographer. He's had a very successful career in the theater, works constantly, and will say that he's not sure it would have gone that way had this one experience not happened when he was 7 or 8 years old. So there's the little act of generosity that can change a life. Excuse me. Paradoxically, though, getting back to generosity, receiving can also be an act of generosity. We don't often talk about it that way. But if you think about it, if we don't accept what someone is offering, are we not depriving them of the joy of giving? And I think we get so hung up on, well, gosh, if I take that, am I worthy of that? Or am I indebted to them? Do I owe them something? Do I have to reciprocate? Am I undeserving of that? But I think it's worth all of us having an inquiry into this question as to whether we do or do not receive well as an act of generosity. Because if someone really gives from the heart, do we want to sort of push it away, deny it, and say, no? Because what are we doing in terms of denying them that opportunity? We know that in this consumerist culture, things like new cars, new iPhones, what possessions make us temporarily happy. It's a fleeting happiness. Once the novelty wears off, we need the next new thing. It's just the nature of impermanence. It's a kind of happiness that is fleeting and not lasting. And I think the Buddha would teach, and we would take from his teachings, that real enduring happiness comes from letting go of our attachments, not accumulating more of them. In my professional career over the years, some of the happiest people I've ever encountered were people that had very little material wealth. But their life perspective was so open-hearted, it was so ungreedy, so unfocused on possessions. That's just not where they thought their happiness lay. And in contrast, I've worked with some people over the years, some of the most unhappy people I know were some of the wealthiest people. But I'm thinking of one person in particular, he worried constantly about losing his wealth, and what if the stock market went down, and what if the plumber came and charged him double because he knew he had a lot of money. I mean, he spent his life suffering because of this wealth and the fear of losing it, the fear of not being able, the fear of being taken advantage of because of his wealth, and so on. When we talk about dana, we're talking about true generosity, not something which is obligatory. So we really do need to look into our hearts and see what motivates us to make this act of generosity. I think we've all experienced giving that doesn't feel generous. It may feel obligatory. It may be motivated by guilt. It may be motivated by a wish to impress others, to feel superior, for our own aggrandizement. I mean, for any number of reasons, we may go through the motions of making a generous act. And those ones that look generous but really aren't, in our tradition we talk about the near enemies. In this case, meaning something that looks unselfish but really isn't because of the attitudes or the motivation behind it, that the authentic moment of generosity is somehow distorted. For every desirable habit, there's a far enemy. That's more obvious. So the antithesis, say, of hatred would be love. The far enemy of love would be hatred. But the near enemies tend to be sneakier. They're a little more subtle. They're a little more hard to catch. Sometimes we're not mindful of them. We're not aware of them. But we can bring our mindfulness to looking at that, to looking at what is our true motive, what are we doing here. This is a poem by Mary Oliver, who's one of my favorite poets. It's called Philip's Birthday. I gave to a friend that I care for deeply something that I loved. It was only a small, extremely shapely bone that came from the ear of a whale. It hurt a little to give it away. The next morning, I went out as usual at sunrise. And there in the harbor was a swan. I don't know what he or she was doing there, but the beauty of it was a gift. Do you see what I mean? You give and you are given. So let's just take a minute and do a reflection, if you would, if you just close your eyes for a moment and find a comfortable position. And just first reflect on these questions. Ask yourself, why do you give? What motivates you to give? Just see what comes up in response to those questions. See what feelings come up as you examine your motivation for giving. And now reflecting on this question. Have there been times in your life when you have felt more able to share than at other times? And if so, why? And now finally, imagine an act of generosity in which you expect nothing in return. How does that feel? Okay, you can open your eyes when you're ready. We'll just ask you to continue to reflect on those questions this week, and as you think about acts of generosity, maybe bring those to mind. This is I guess a parable from a story of a woman in Israel named Rachel. Rachel was a pious woman whose home in Tel Aviv was open to all, like the legendary home of Abraham and Sarah. There was never a day when she and her husband did not have guests. Rabbis, simple people alike, all ate at their table, and everyone was treated like a king or a queen. Some guests lived in the house for months at a time. Sometimes there were 10 such guests, at other times as many as 30. And all of them were made to feel as if they were in their own home. Rachel was always ready to give everything she had to another human being. She had reached perfection in kindness, and her giving was done wholeheartedly and joyfully. Another aspect of the perfection of her perfection in kindness was reported by one of her sons, who said that his mother once sent him to borrow money from a neighbor. When he returned with the money in hand, she took the envelope with the money in it from him, placed it somewhere, and never opened it. Her son asked, "Mother, why did you borrow the money if you didn't need it or want to use it?" "I did it," she explained, "so that our neighbor won't be ashamed to borrow from us when he's in need." So the practice of generosity is really a practice of freedom for us. It's freedom from greed, hatred, delusion, from clinging, from the suffering that comes from those hindrances. And sometimes the currencies, if you will, of generosity are described as money, our energy, our time, our talent, and our love. So as we did in the reflection a few minutes ago, we really need to look into our hearts and explore our motives for generosity. Is it ego? Is it self-interest? Is it true generosity? And usually we can know that by our response. If we engage in an act of generosity and experience some true happiness as a result, then that's probably a pretty good sign that the generosity was authentic, not self-serving, but truly from the heart. 3 types of giving are described in Buddhist literature. Fettered giving, which is giving reluctantly. Friendly giving, in which we enjoy giving. And then kingly giving, which is selfless and gracious. And any of these acts can occur in our relationships, internally to ourselves. We can direct generosity toward ourselves in terms of forgiveness and compassion. We can do so randomly to strangers. We can do it in terms of service work, like Jim was describing earlier with the river cleanup. And sometimes generosity is something as simple as forgiveness. To let go of an anger or resentment can be an act of generosity. To release someone from the grip of our own anger and our resentment. Or maybe giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Or sometimes being generous of spirit. I love that term. If so-and-so is generous of spirit, you know that they just bring that sort of attitude of generosity to everything. So the Buddha recognized this. He recognized that our happiness was not dependent upon our external circumstances, but it was the result of the cultivation of a generous heart. He knew this, and he made this the number one foundational practice for spiritual attainment. You know the story of the hungry ghost in Buddhism? These are the folks with the bloated stomachs and the very narrow throats, so they can never be fulfilled. They can never get enough to eat. And it's been said that generosity transforms our hungry ghost into decent, open-hearted human beings. And it strengthens our connection to others by opening our hearts to them and to the world. You will recall that the Buddha set up his community of monks so that generosity had a central place. The monks were dependent upon the generosity of the lay community. They have to make alms rounds every day. They take their alms bowl to go to the village and ask for food. And they would not have survived without the generosity of the lay community. So again, from the canon, how a person of integrity gives a gift. These 5 are a person of integrity's gifts. Which 5? A person of integrity gives a gift with a sense of conviction. A person of integrity gives a gift attentively. A person of integrity gives a gift in season. A person of integrity gives a gift with an empathic heart. And a person of integrity gives a gift without adversely affecting himself or others. So back to where we began, generosity. If we commit one act of generosity a day, it will increase our experience of happiness. If we engage in multiple acts of generosity a day, truly from the heart, then it will increase our happiness even more. I'd like to close with a poem from Hafiz, the Persian poet from the Middle Ages. This one's called The Union. Our union is like this. You feel cold, so I reach for a blanket to cover our shivering feet. A hunger comes into your body, so I run to my garden and start digging potatoes. You ask for a few words of comfort and guidance. I quickly kneel at your side, offering you this whole book as a gift. You ached with loneliness one night, so much you weep. And I say, here's a rope. Tie it around me. Hafiz will be your companion for life. So let's just sit for a minute if we could. We've got a couple minutes. So thank you for your time and attention.